Samira Sheikh, who's a professor of history at Vanderbilt, was a student at MS University in Baroda. And as a graduate student, when I spoke to her, she said, when I was a student, a business family by the name of the Hari Bhakti family donated an entire go-down of private banking materials to the university, and it's been locked in a room ever since. No one has ever opened it. Would you like to go and check it out? So equipped with this little nugget of knowledge, I persuaded Devesh Kapoor, who was an advisor of mine at Penn when I was a student, to give me a little bit of cash so I could go and do this. And he gambled the first dollar on this project, so I credit him for his support as well. So I spent a full summer in Baroda looking at these materials. Now, venturing into these archives was an extreme sport for anyone who's done extreme sports in historical archiving work. Archive that hasn't been open since 1986. You can imagine the kind of state that it's in. I dealt with rat feces, pigeon poop. I dealt with all kinds of other things I can't describe. Fell sick many, many times. This was pre-COVID. I should have known better and masked up, and but I didn't do that. So that was my fault. So any historians here, make sure you mask up before you go in. And critters I'd never seen before with all kinds of formations, right? Finally, made my way through this archive, and what I learned by looking at these banking papers from a little later period, 18th, 19th century, is that Mughal history has been written from the perspective of mature state sources, from state bureaucratic sources. So, in some senses, what we know of Mughal history is an idealized vision of what the empire thought of itself. These papers taught me that there are allied groups, especially banking families, that have been involved with state formation during the post-Mughal period, and these papers document that process very well. They suggest that modern states in late 18th and 19th century South Asia were essentially funded entirely by capital lent by private bankers. This is just one segment of a small family archive. They had multiple branches scattered across Western India. Some of the materials were lost, like in the Surat fire in the 19th century. But what was surviving is what I had access to. This archive taught me that political relationships are revealed when we start looking at state power through the lens of actors that are not necessarily involved with mature state bureaucracy or bureaucratic formations. Unfortunately, the earlier generation, because of maybe because they had other priorities, but really focused on the sources produced by the empire, right? Mughal chronicles in Persian, documents produced by the empire and its functionaries. This project or this archive taught me to think a little bit differently about that. So this is one set of materials, but this is for a later period, right? This is for the 18th and 19th century. This material got me thinking that if there were allied groups involved with state power in a later period, might there be allied groups in an earlier period involved with Mughal state power? And if so, what does that look like? Well, unfortunately, unlike the Medicis and the Rothschilds of Europe, for example, which have beautifully preserved archives that you can actually visit online and download whatever you need and read it at your fingertips over a cup of coffee in your pajamas, you cannot do that with the Mughal Empire because banking families who have survived did not survive in terms of the archival record. So I had to figure out another way. And this is where language learning and kind of coming at it from a literary angle plays a big role. If you want to do South Asian history pre-1800, you have to have some sense of literature and some sense of languages. And it is a range of materials that I was able to tap into and gather over time that allowed me to think about non-state actors who were involved with state power. And again, this material is not typical of what you would think of them leaving behind. This just gives you a range of the languages and kinds of materials that were involved. For me, the materials in red here became really, really important, and they are in the book. So for those who are interested and curious, I've translated some important materials from these sources in particular. What I learned in the process is that non-Western societies in the modern and pre-modern period even do have sources for writing economic history and monetary history. It's just not the kind of archive that you would expect if you were used to reading European history. So if you're going to think that you're going to find a beautiful scroll of materials like a Medici account book, which I show my students all the time at Penn, you're not going to get that for South Asia. And second, they aren't conveniently located in one place. So you have to do a bit of excavation and digging, and you have to kind of parcel out materials from a wide range of repositories, some of which, actually most of which, are either private, held by the family members, or scattered across various private libraries, and a real exercise in collecting has to take place for that to happen. Let me give you a sense of what these materials look like, okay? Just to give you a sense of the visual nature of them. This is a loan, one of the earliest and only loan documents that we have documenting family loans to the Mughal Empire. This is for 5.5 lakh rupees. That's 550,000 rupees at the time. To give you a sense of what that's worth in a mainly agrarian economy like the Mughal Empire, you could buy 10 kilograms of wheat for about 1 rupee. A military day laborer would take anywhere between half a rupee and 3 rupees, depending on their skill level for their work. A typical household servant would take something like 1 rupee a month. And so on and so forth. So you get an idea. 500,000 rupees is quite a large sum. 500,000 rupees is enough money to sustain a provincial army of several thousand for anywhere between 1 and 2 months. Okay, so a spot loan of $500,000 could make the difference between you sustaining your provincial army for the next 1 or 2 months or losing battle. Okay, so this is a large sum of money. This is a loan outlining 500,000 rupees to Prince Murad Bakhsh during a time when he was contending for the princely throne. And it is during princely tournaments for emperorship that I first noticed money becoming a really important source in Mughal politics. I'll say more about that a little bit later, but just to get a sense of what this looks like. This material, by the way, comes from contemporary descendants of the family. So it was actually having to kind of meet the family and ask them to dig out materials from their attic, which they said they didn't have, but eventually found out they actually do have materials. So don't take no for an answer, I suppose, is the first learning there. Here's the second set of materials. This is a prashasti. A prashasti in Sanskrit is a praise poem, something that commemorates somebody else. And this is a praise poem from the 17th century, and this is a modern 20th century kind of copied version of that. This poem has been absent in Mughal studies for a very long time, partly because the original manuscript was sandwiched between a larger folio and it's circulated with itinerant Jain monks until it was discovered in the 1950s and then transcribed. So again, materials from the 17th century may not be entirely lost to us. We're just waiting for someone to find them. This is one example of that. This is a Sanskrit praise poem that documents members of the banking family, which I'll talk about later, and their role in Mughal politics and their importance in ideas of sovereignty and practices of Mughal administration. And my favorite source, we're allowed to have favorite sources as scholars of history, I think. So I will tell you my favorite source is Miratul Haqaiq, which means mirror of events or mirror of truths, depending how you want to translate it. This is the unpublished diary of a low-level Mughal bureaucrat hanging out in Surat, Ahmedabad, Baroda, and essentially someone who took the pain to compile daily news reports from his locality, also entering his own laments about his own personal fate and things that were happening around him. He was a real complainer, but that makes this diary really, really valuable. And we need to have complainers in history to write history, right? So this is about 489 folios, and we know it's incomplete because there's a catchword at the bottom of the last folio, and there's no materials to follow. So this is probably a much larger work than what you see here. And a sole copy of it exists at the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. It was purchased by one Scotsman, Fraser, in the money markets of Ahmedabad, possibly even gifted to him, we don't know. And he donated this back to the Bodleian Library in the 18th century. So in some senses, thank God for colonial collectors, because we have this diary because of him.